Stephen Avery. He's a man who has a history that is deep, dark, sordid, and yet not exactly what you'd expect. Because if you were to look at the overview of his life, you'd see a man in prison a lot. One who clearly has a mind that isn't the best, and so on. But in truth, that's only half the story, because while he has done bad things, he's also been convicted wrongly of doing worse things. And yet through it all, he's found people to help and support him. So allow us to ask, does Stephen Avery have a girlfriend? Number 7. Early relationships. To look at where he's at now relationship-wise, you need to understand the life of Stephen Avery, the relationships that were in his life before it all went wrong, and the few people he was able to connect with before. Stephen Avery was born in 1962 in Manitowoc County, Wisconsin, to Alan and Dolores Avery. Since 1965, his family has operated a salvage yard in rural Gibson, Wisconsin, and the 40-acre property where they lived outside of town. Avery has 3 siblings, Chuck, Earl, and Barb. He attended public schools in nearby Mishicot and Manitowoc, where his mother said he went to an elementary school for slower kids. According to one of his lawyers in 1985, school records showed that his intelligence quotient was 70 and that he barely functioned in school, which would explain a lot, not just about his life, but his relationships. On July 24, 1982, Avery married Lori Matheson, who was a single mother. They have 4 children together, Rachel, Jenny, and twins Stephen and Will. So as you can see, he wasn't incapable of having relationships, even having a wife and kids at one point. But as time went on, the darker elements of Avery's life came forward, and it changed a lot of things. Number 6. Law troubles. It's fair to say that Avery was not the greatest person on earth, as he did have trouble with the law from time to time, specifically in the 80s. His first offense was going and robbing a store with a friend, and that got him 10 months in jail. Then, he apparently killed his cat alongside some friends, and that led him to going back to jail for animal cruelty. 1985 proved to be one of the worst years of his life, as apparently his cousin was spreading very unflattering rumors about him, and he ran her off the road and pointed an unloaded gun at her to get her to stop doing that. He was sentenced to 6 years for that crime. But also in 1985, he was accused of something that he would later be proven innocent for after 18 years. Number 5. The murder and arrest. In July of 1985, a woman named Penny Bernstein was assaulted and violated while on a jog one day. During a photo lineup, she said it was Avery who was the attacker. You'd think that this would be a pretty definitive statement, as she was the only one assaulted and thus would know the face of her attacker. But as you likely already know, this was only the beginning of a very complicated matter. We say that because Avery was 40 miles away in Green Bay shortly after the attack. An alibi was supported by time-stamped store receipts and 16 eyewitnesses. That's a lot of people saying he wasn't there, and yet he was arrested and charged with the crime, getting 32 years in jail for it. But the worst was yet to come, we assure you. In 1995, a detective made a call to the jail that Avery was at and noted that an inmate had admitted committing an assault years ago in Manitowoc County and that someone else was in jail for it. The sheriff at the jail didn't believe him, and thus Avery remained in jail. Finally, in 2002, the Innocence Project used DNA evidence to prove that Avery was innocent and that a man named Gregory Allen had done the deed. What's important to note here is that Allen and Avery honestly did look alike. So at the very least, this was a case of mistaken identity gone horribly wrong. But while that should have been the happiest point in Avery's recent life, it was all too brief. Number 4. Teresa Halbach. Teresa Halbach was a photographer born in 1980. 25 years later, in early November, she went missing and her parents called in to the police to let them know that their daughter was missing. Now, lest you think that her parents were just overreacting, they hadn't seen their daughter in days, and she honestly lived right next door to them. So if anyone would have noticed that she was gone, it would be her parents. Halbach was known to have visited the Avery salvage yard in Manitowoc County on October 31, 2005, days before her death. On November 10, 2005, following the discovery of a Toyota RAV4 vehicle partially concealed on the Avery property, Calumet County Sheriff Jerry Pagel conducted a search and found the charred remains of Halbach. Her cell phone, license plates, and car key were also recovered. A few days later, Stephen Avery's blood was found in her vehicle. a clear sign that he was involved in part or in whole with what happened to her. Or at least, that's what many stated. Avery was charged with the kidnapping and murder of Halbach, mutilation of a corpse, and illegal possession of a firearm. Number 3. Controversy. Almost from the get-go, there were issues with the case, not least of which was that some of the county sheriffs and law enforcement were involved in proving Avery guilty of the previous crime were allowed to investigate the new case despite there being a civil suit by Avery against them. And some of the quote key evidence was indeed quote found by them. But as Avery's lawyers noted multiple times, not only was there a conflict of interest, there was evidence that was clearly tampered with, including a vial of Avery's blood from his wrongful conviction that had been unsealed, and a puncture wound was found in the top as if to draw blood from the vial. Another controversy that came about was that of his nephew, Brendan Ray Dassey, who confessed to helping Avery with the attack on Teresa, but later he recanted as he said he was coerced by the cops as they didn't let him have a lawyer present. Avery was found guilty of first-degree murder and illegal possession of a firearm and was sentenced to life in prison, as well as not getting the possibility of a parole. His story would have ended there until... Number 2. Making a Murderer. In January 2016, after Making a Murderer had been released on Netflix, it was here that Avery's stock took a rise in various ways, not least of which was socially, because while criminals do get pen pal letters from curious folk, this was different. Avery became the face of the wrongs of the criminal justice system, and as a result, people were interested in his story and what would become of him. In some ways, he was a cult hero because he was trying to get freedom for crimes he didn't commit. After the release of Making a Murderer and the praise it got from awards shows, people started screaming for justice to be done, and while Avery isn't freed yet, you could argue that the documentary helped him in various ways, including his social life briefly. Number 1. Relationship status. So as you can imagine, Avery has been through a lot, and so his relationship status, if you will, isn't exactly the best around. Ironically though, he did have a pen pal that would go on to be his girlfriend and then fiance, but then she broke it off after being called various names by various people, including Avery. She painted a very dark picture of him, but others wonder if that's honestly what happened. Some even called her an attention whore. You can guess the rest, and she was merely using Avery's fame for Making a Murderer to get fame for herself. As of right now, Avery is single, and more than likely it's gonna stay that way until he potentially gets out. Because any relationship he has would be stunted by his current situation and the uncertainty of whether he'll be able to see anyone outside of a prisoner's visitation area. In short, his game is very limited. So what do you think? What do you think of this look at Stephen Avery and how his life and relationships have been affected over the years? Are you surprised by his current relationship status, or you think that this is something that he deserves? What do you think will happen with Avery if he is indeed freed? Let us know in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the channel.